This is week 2 of Tell the Story, and so we're focused on how to do chronological Bible story, some different models of evangelism, which we'll talk about today, and kind of use this to unpack over the next several weeks, and then how to tell our own story in conjunction with Bible stories, conversation, etc. And I want to start with a funny evangelism video just because I like to laugh at myself sometimes. So here we go.
Okay, this is it. We're going out. First call. Time to be a hero. Brilliant. Come on. Let's go. Get this. Get this.
Rook!
Yeah.
Hold on there, Rook. We're not going out on this one.
Why not?
We're not ready. No, we're not. Just go back to bed. I'll let you know. All right? Go on. Hey, Rookie. Get back to work. We're training.
No. The alarm.
We're just training. Go. We're training. Do it. Go. No. Not until this place is spotless. Let's go. Come on.
Hey, Rookie, no. Keep working out. We're not strong enough yet.
No. It's not a good time. Not a good time.
Hey, come on, the fajitas will burn. Calm down.
Oh, I just got comfortable.
Somebody shut that thing off! It's the best part.
No.
No, it's not safe. I'm not feeling it.
Not safe. Seriously? We're firefighters.
Slow down there, overachiever.
You don't even know if people out there like firefighters. I'm not feeling called.
Not feeling it. People are dying out there.
People die every day, Rookie.
Don't you think something's wrong here? I mean, isn't it strange that we're a fire station? We don't even put out fires?
Nope.
We're not getting this one. There's other stations.
Come on, it's right next door.
Hey, if they want our help, they come and ask us. When we go there acting like we're the big shots, we got all the answers. Hey, they may not even want our help.
Help me!
They could be talking anyway.
You firefighters, help me!
I gotta catch this call first.
So there's obviously a dark moral to that story of actually using what we learn. So I shared a bunch of different models for conversion, biblical models for conversion, for evangelism, for what does faith look like in multiple stories from the Gospels and from Acts. And so I want to dial down a little bit more into what is evangelism. And I think one of the things that we forget is that a lot of times evangelism is introducing strangers to a person. It's easy to turn Christianity into an idea or a philosophy or a culture or a political party or a diet plan or any number of things that we get sidetracked with evangelizing people into. I can remember going out and doing door knocking in my early days, learning how to evangelize. I was with a guy, and this is when Clinton was president, or trying to be president. And we're knocking on this guy's door, and he has a Clinton sign in the yard. And this guy says, "Hey, we're from such and such church, and we're here to talk about Jesus, but I also want to talk to you about the sign out here in your yard." And I remember back then thinking, "Wait a second, what does that have to do at all with the gospel? That's such a side issue." Or sometimes we'd have ladies in church, stand up at testimony time and talk about, "Oh man, I really got to share Christ with someone. There was this girl who was dressed immodestly, and I was able to share with her about, biblical modesty." That was a huge concern at that church we were at. And there's so many times where things get sidetracked into into other things. And when we study evangelism, a lot of times we study apologetics, we get into the writings of C.S. Lewis and a lot of other Christian thinkers, and it's easy to turn all of the faith into this kind of rationalistic data that we learn. And the reality is that evangelism is an introduction to a person, the person of Jesus. And not that theology is not important in this. There's lots of the Bible says that fits under that model. But there's all these different ways that we can take and distort what is evangelism, and so it winds up being some kind of cultural imperialism or political imperialism or something like this. Evangelism is focused on making disciples. Now that seems pretty self-evident, and in a moment I have a picture to show you where we'll realize there's some differences in how people see this. But I would say disciples and not converts or believers. And I'm using these words in a very intentional way. So when we use the word disciple, we're talking about someone who is actually following in the footsteps of Jesus. And when I use the word convert or believer, I mean someone who might just merely give mental assent. There's a lot of short-term trips or evangelistic outreach events where the main goal is to kind of count numbers at the end. We want something to show for it. And so that's not the main goal. The main goal of the Great Commission, the main goal of evangelism ultimately is to make disciples, not just to make people who will say yes. And you can see Jesus. He gathers larger and larger crowds, and the crowds swell as he does great signs or as he performs miracles for them. And at some point, inevitably, he kind of thins out the herd. And when they start thinning out, he doesn't do our thing, which is, oh my gosh, why are people thinning out? Let's go. Maybe we didn't communicate it well. There's one story where he looks at his disciples and he goes, "Are you going to leave also?" And so Jesus isn't just gathering the numbers. He's not gathering the masses. So we present the gospel to the masses. We invite the masses. But we're looking for disciples, not just people who will pray a prayer. If praying a prayer is the standard of evangelism, we could have a lot better results. But that's not what it is. Our goal and our line of demarcation should be discipleship. Evangelism is sharing what we have experienced through Jesus. I know this is true of myself at multiple times in my life. Maybe it's also true of you. It's easy to share. Again, this kind of goes back to that first one. It's introduction to a person, not to ideas or culture or philosophy, etc. Sometimes it's easy to convince someone you need to follow Jesus without ourselves in that moment be experiencing the joy of our salvation. And I've been convicted a number of times over the years where I'm very passionately talking with someone who's an atheist or a Buddhist or a Muslim or any number of people at a time where I'm burnt out and I'm overworked and I'm bitter or angry or any number of things. And it's this doesn't mean we should not share the gospel, but this is the call for us to be experiencing something. And I think when we experience Jesus and we experience our salvation in that way, this becomes much more invitational and much more attractional to people who are watching. It doesn't appear to be this kind of bifurcated lives where here's what we say up here, but then here's what we actually do. I think probably most challenging for us, particularly those of us who are parents, is to do this in front of our children. I meet so many young atheists who grew up in church. I'd say almost all atheists that I've met, there might be 2 or 3 that I can count, have grown up with a church experience. And for a lot of them, it was, well, I saw what happened inside our home. My parents talked the talk, but when it came down to it, there was no reality to their life. Now, I think everyone has to make their own decision, and ultimately, these children have to stand before God and explain themselves. But it's important for us, inside the home, outside the home, to be living and experiencing what we say salvation brings to our life. We tell people God can heal your marriage, but we live with a broken marriage. We tell people, God can fix this problem or that problem, but we're just embracing these things and not dealing with any of these things. So I think this is kind of an important first step for us. Evangelism based on sharing our lives with others while we follow Jesus. I think sometimes we try to boil evangelism down to the plan of salvation, and I'll talk more about that. But the reality is that we have to be sharing our lives while we follow Jesus. we do this weird thing where we try to keep ourselves separate from anybody that's not like us. And whether we try to do this or not, this tends to be the result. We hang out with people who are just like us. And on the biggest category, that would be we typically have more Christian friends than non-Christian friends. And so we might go out and share the gospel with someone. They might not know any other Christians. We might be the only Christian they know. But because we don't really invite them into our lives a lot, they have no idea about the expectation. Then we go and present the gospel to them. We say, hey, do you want to go to hell when you die? No, of course you don't. Do you want to go to heaven? Of course you do. And so we share the gospel and they say yes. We say, look, there's nothing you can do to work and earn this. They say yes. They pray the prayer. We go, great. We want you to come to church on Sunday. And they're like, oh, okay, that's part of this? I have to go to church now, okay? And then, they go to church on Sunday. They hear a sermon about tithing. They wait. I have to go to church on Sundays, and I have to give up 10% of my income. And then now we spend the next 20, 30 years of their Christian life trying to kind of beat them into submission. Whereas if our lives were connected prior to their salvation experience, they would see what does it look like, assuming we are living this out. Again, see the previous one on sharing what we've experienced. Assuming we're living this out, they would see what is the expectation of Christian marriage. How do Christian men treat their wives? How do Christian wives treat their husbands? How do Christian parents treat their kids, et cetera, et cetera? And so before they would ever make a commitment to Christ, they would have done plenty of observable research in our lives and the lives of our friends. So I think that's an important element, is that not that we don't ever learn, the Romans Road or 4 spiritual laws, but sometimes we just take it and we reduce it to this kind of sales pitch without realizing, a lot of the early Christians lived in community with each other and lived very public, open lives where people were able to see and witness. And the early apologists, this is actually how they defended Christianity, was by saying, look at our lives. You will see X, Y, and Z. You will see we're not doing these other things. And so they would appeal to the lives of the church members. Not going to point any fingers, name any names, but is that a strategy that we would use in today's church culture? I don't just mean Willcrest, I mean pick any church. I would be cautious at best. That would be a scary thing. And I definitely wouldn't want anybody using my life necessarily as, this is the one. So this is just kind of opportunity to reflect. Evangelism must have people as its object. Again, this seems pretty obvious, but it's often lost. If you want to learn how to share the gospel with Muslims, what's the step we normally go through? We read a book about Islam as a theological system. We study where its weaknesses, where its flaws, how do we formulate a response to these things. All of this is happening in a theoretical space. It's all just a mind game at this point. And so our object is, how do we defeat this other worldview? And so we create some kind of apologetic. I remember doing this before heading to the Middle East. I knew a lot about Islam. I got to the Middle East and realized I knew more about Islam than a lot of my friends knew about Islam. And many times the responses that I had prepared to answer objection X or Y, they didn't even believe it. They didn't even care. They were fairly secular. And now I'm thinking, wow, I almost need them to be better Muslims so that I can share the gospel. And then I realized the cart and the horse have gotten mixed up here. I should start with people. And people will ask me all the time, Brian, is this a Muslim belief? Because my friend said this. I said, well, it really doesn't matter if it's an official belief. They might just be a very unorthodox Muslim, or it might be an unorthodox Mormon. Pick the group, it doesn't matter. Sometimes we study things in a book as a rational system, and we lose the fact that people are the object of salvation. And so, we can't go after worldviews. It's important to understand the other worldview. If you take any of the other classes I've taught, you know that I believe this. Religions, ideas, political parties, ethnic groups. There's no you people in evangelism. We have to focus on the person. We have to focus on the whole person. This is head, heart, hands, knowing, being, and doing. And a lot of times we pick one of those. You've got people who are all about the social gospel and not about the salvation side of things. You have people who only want to teach theology and not actually do anything. And we kind of pick a lane and stay in our lane, but God is a whole being. He is head, heart, hands. We are head, heart, hands, knowing, being, and doing. And so we have to have the whole man, the whole person, as the object. Now, I say we have to have people as the object, and I keep referencing the fact that numbers become a thing. I've blanked out the names because some of you actually might know them. This is from a group that works here in Houston and other places for that matter. And they like to go door knocking through apartment complexes. Now, I want to make sure, at the end of last session, I encouraged us not to put down other systems, and I'm not putting the system down. I'm trying not to. I'm just trying to understand kind of its philosophical basis. Okay? So what you see here is here's how many people they have in teams. So they have 30 people in teams. They've had 146 encounters. This is the large picture. They've prayed with 72 people. They've shared the gospel with 46. So of these, you can see now that people are red, yellow, and green. So red people are those who just wanted nothing to do with it. Yellow people are kind of ambivalent one way or the other. Green people are people that are interested and ready to go. One of these people came and talked with me about, hey, can we do something together? And I was trying to explain, look, I believe in a longer term approach than this because discipleship is my goal, not just getting numbers. And so I said, I'm focused on how do I train people in my church who are in the workplace and in the school and in neighborhoods and sports teams and wherever they are, how can they, in a long, sustained way, bring the gospel into those relationships? That's my strategy. He goes, no, I think we're really saying the same thing. And I've seen the pictures they put up on Facebook like this. And I said, no, I don't think we are. And it kind of goes back and forth. I said, okay, here's my question. What do you do with the red people? And he goes, well, we really just focus on the green people. I said, well, I'm a pastor, staff at a church, and I would love to only have to deal with people that are really ready, like put all of our church on a spectrum of red, yellow, and green of who's ready to do whatever. I would love to just have people here that are just ready to go, but that's not how discipleship in a large community where we're all at different places in our walk with Christ, that's not how it works. Some people are ready, some people are not yet ready, and so I can't just pastor people who are ready. I have to figure out how do I disciple across the spectrum. And evangelism is the same thing. Take any apartment complex around here. You've probably got 15, 20, sometimes more ethnicities, languages. You probably have a half dozen religions represented. So obviously the people who are going to be in the green category are people who have more contact and experience with Christians and with Christianity. The people who have less are going to be people coming from another religion, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. And so automatically this plan predisposes us to kind of stay away from people who are hard case, basically to stay away from the unreached. If the unreached aren't ready to be reached, we're not going to reach them. And I have a huge objection to this. That's why the unreached are unreached, is they're hard to reach. They speak different languages, and they have different worldviews, and they have different questions in life. And if we just always skirt them to find the easy people. Now, that said, I understand their plan. Their plan is God is already at work in somebody's life, and so, let's go find that person and let's start with them. Okay, that's not bad. But in reality, what they wind up doing is just leaving behind everybody else who's a hard case. And I don't think that that's a sustainable plan. I don't think that part's very biblical. And so this goes back to a verse we read last week, John 3:16, God so loved the world, he gave his only son, but then 2 verses later it says, those who believe are saved. Those who do not believe are condemned already. And so sometimes methods like this that are based around, high numbers driven focus, sometimes they forget that the gospel is always effective. They associate effectiveness with people saying yes to Jesus, but sometimes people turning their hearts away. Is the gospel being effective? It's just having a different effect. And so we don't want to just mix up success with effectiveness, because God will be successful in the end, but that might not look like our standard. Okay. One of my favorite quotes is by a man named Ray Bakke. He's an urban missiologist. He says, when the city grows larger, our witness must become more personal. And I think in a city like Houston, or depending on how diverse your workplace might be, the greater size and the greater diversity, probably the more your default is going to be, let's do something frantically. Let's do something quickly. Let's do mass whatever we do. And he says, whenever the city grows larger, our witness has to become more personal. So the whole city experiences, everything becomes massive. right? Everybody knows when Christmas and Easter are happening in our neighborhoods because every 10 churches in every single neighborhood are sending out mass mailers during this time. And most of us probably do what I do with them and just take them and go bloop and dump them in the trash can. And so that's a mass approach. And again, I'm not saying God can't use a mass approach. I'm sure there are people who are right there on the brink who pick that up and go, you know what? This was the thing I'm looking for. But our default needs to be, where has God put me? And how do I plug in right there where God has put me? So I want to look at the gospel from kind of what it's not, or how people can fixate on one element of it. So, is the gospel the salvation of souls? I would say to a degree, yes. This is part of what the focus of the gospel is salvation of souls. But then you have people that this is the only thing the gospel is, and it becomes this very hurried, frantic, kind of fire insurance salesman type approach of, well, you don't want to go to hell. All right, pray this prayer. All right, we counted our number. Let's go on to the next guy. And there's not a very deep discipleship approach. Is the gospel social justice? This is a pretty common one, especially amongst younger generations today, particularly those who are getting into racial reconciliation and other things. And when this becomes the lens that evangelism is seen, you wind up with some kind of Christian-y Marxism, and that becomes problematic. I think the gospel will bring justice into the world, in the same way that I think the gospel will save souls, but when we take that as our sole lens to see the gospel, it warps some of the other elements and it diverts us in a particular area. Is the gospel philosophy? One of my favorite theologians, Francis Schaeffer, is very big on having a Christian worldview and thinking like a Christian, and many other people are in this as well. So there's lots of talk on worldviews, but if you just turn Christianity into a philosophy, I think there is a philosophical side of Christianity for sure, but we wind up with just kind of Gnosticism. We have a lot of philosophical answers about the world that really nobody is asking. What about psychology? Are there psychological elements? In fact, Schaeffer was, I think, actually formerly a psychologist. And in some of his books, he would talk about psychological healing in the here and now. So that was a big thing for him. But if that becomes the sole lens, much like these others, that can distort and wind up with Christianity as just self-help. And we can see whole churches or even denominations that get into preaching now as just series on marriage or family or how to manage your money. Not that the Bible doesn't have answers for these things. I believe it does. But that's not the point of preaching. That's not the reason why these books were written. And so that can be a dangerous lens also. What about civil religion? We don't get this one quite as much in terms of this, but you'll see it a lot in American culture where, America is a Christian country, and God has put us in this time and place for us to use our vast resources and Christianness to bless the world. So this has the idea of American exceptionalism, or another idea is manifest destiny, that God has put us here on a track to do great things in the world. This has certainly seeped into American thinking. It's certainly seeped into church thinking, and even generationally into thinking of, Tony and I were just talking about how kind of younger generations, they get into short-term missions because they think, I'm going to have an impact. It's this manifest destiny that with resources and technology and science, we're going to go out and show the world a better way. Sometimes you come up to this one in evangelism, especially here in Texas. What do you mean am I a Christian? I'm from Texas. What kind of question is it? People have that attitude of, why are you sharing the gospel with me? I'm from Texas.
My parents go to church.
Yeah, my parents go to church. I grew up in church. And it's a civil religion where it's something that happens as a cultural phenomenon and not much else. For many people, that's how they see it. And so for their mind, the actions of the government and the actions of the church are synonymous and should be synonymous. And of course, this is where we can get into some interesting things politically. So I want to say, for me, one of the foundational elements of what is the gospel is the person of Jesus Christ. You can't take Jesus out of the gospel. And it's the Missio Dei, so that would be more its application into the world. So the Missio Dei means the mission of God. But this is one way, not just of seeing what is missions. It is one way of seeing what is missions, but it's also a way of seeing God's nature, his character. So his character is this sendingness. Okay, God sent his Son. In the beginning, God sent his word. He said, let there be, and there was. So the whole story of creation, fall, redemption, all of this is part of God as a sending being. This is part of the Missio Dei. As a missiological principle, the Missio Dei goes against like the colonial era of missions, missions is this activity and this project that we go out and do in the world, or even some modern day versions of that still happen. The Missio Dei is more about what is God doing in the world, what does the Bible say is God's nature, and what is he doing in the world, and how do we engage in that? And I believe that this last line right here will capture elements of all of these things. When we understand what is God doing in the world, God is enacting justice in the world. And ultimately, he will create justice everywhere. Now, it will be through either judgment or salvation, ultimately. God is saving souls. What about the souls he's not saving, though? I mean, so with each of these, we see where God is working and God is taking part in this. But then there's also areas where we see, but he hasn't done this, or he hasn't done this yet. When we think of the gospel, a lot of times we equate the gospel with a method of persuasion. And so I have a pyramid here I want to show you. Because we equate it with a method of persuasion, it's easy to turn evangelism into kind of a sales pitch where we obnoxiously go knock on doors or shout in a public, go to a mall and try to do something publicly. And that scares a lot of people if that's what evangelism is, I don't want to do it. But I think the gospel, I think evangelism is a much bigger thing. So this is from Scott McKnight. He says, rather than seeing evangelism and the gospel as a method of persuasion, the Romans Road, or John 3:16, or the 4 spiritual laws, or 2 ways to live, or any of these kind of plans, he says we need to understand the grand narrative of Scripture. This is the foundation for everything we know about the gospel. From Genesis all the way to the end, what is the story that God is telling? And God is telling a story of a eternal being who is loving and just and triune and creative and has a will and has personhood, and he creates a world that then falls into sin that must then be saved. And he has a plan for that as well, and this comes through Jesus. And so the next, what is built on top of this foundation, the grand narrative, is the story of Jesus. Or really, we can say the story of the Messiah, that there's this messianic figure prophesied from Genesis 3:15, and follows all the way through to Christ, that he is the one who's coming. And then we see the New Testament, kind of a subset of this will be the New Testament claims that Jesus is this Old Testament messianic person. This becomes the next level up. And then there's the plan of salvation comes out of this. We see that through Christ's death, burial, resurrection, through repentance and belief, through the Holy Spirit awakening us, that this salvation then is applied to us on an individual level. And out of that comes a method of persuasion. Now that method of persuasion is, how am I going to talk to my cousin or my brother or my coworker or whoever? That becomes it. But if we just start with, okay, you want to share the gospel, here's the ABCs of the gospel, or here's 4 spiritual laws. Not that those things are bad tools, but we have to start at the bottom. We have to start back again with the grand narrative of Scripture. This is important more than just to understand the gospel. We're also engaging a culture that does not understand the basic story. And so 50 years ago, there was some kind of Christian assumption of more like, what kind of Christian are you? What denomination are you? But in today's world, we can't assume that young people today have a Bible background, which means if we don't have an understanding of a fallen, sinful race that can't save themselves, a perfect, holy, just God sending his Son to bear our sin doesn't really make a lot of sense in today's world. And so this is actually one of the reasons I think why, you've taken me the polls or whatnot, you can see there's a steep fall off in the younger generations who are still practicing Christianity from the prior generations. So here's, I want to get a little bit into strategies here. This is from Sam Chan in that book I referenced last week. His first strategy is get our friends to become their friends. And he talks about plausibility structures. So in many parts of the world, like I said, Christians and non-Christians don't really hang out a lot, which means if you start hanging out with lost people, you might be the only Christian that they know. When you're the only person that knows something, it seems implausible because to a degree, we find information to be believable or not based on who we're hanging out with. So I live in Texas. I have lots of friends who own guns. The idea that more guns equals less crime makes sense to me in a way that my friends who live in Canada and don't have any friends who own any guns and have no experience, background, knowledge, etc., would say that that idea is ludicrous. And so when I try to convince them, no, individual right to own guns is actually makes us safer. If I'm the only one in their circle, it just, whether it's right or not has nothing to do with it. It seems implausible based on the fact that everybody else has created a sounding chamber around them saying, no, this is false. The reverse is also true. When they're the only one in my circle of people saying, hey, you Americans and your guns, y'all need to just get rid of them, your world will be better. Whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter. It seems implausible to me because everyone I know agrees with, oh yeah, we're in Texas, we all own guns, it's no big deal. And so, again, this is not to get into the gun debate and say yes or no. This is to say we create structures that support our beliefs. This is also known as culture. Culture supports our beliefs. So when we're of one culture, that creates a system where our beliefs make sense to us and we don't question it. And people who question it tend to be viewed as some kind of social pariah. So his whole thing is, what if we start inviting our two worlds together? Their friends become our friends become their friends. Now it's not you're the only weirdo in their group. Now it's, they meet lots of people. I was just talking with a friend who lives in Norway this last week, and he says, in some of the small villages, there might just be one or two Christians. And so he has friends who are Christian, and when they live out in these places, they're the only Christian out there. There's not, another church in the area. And to them, it just seems implausible that he said they see them as these weird people who still hang on to this belief that there's a God. And they treat them almost like some kind of, like we might treat someone that had come out of the jungle and has a bone through their nose or something. Like, oh, that's interesting, we haven't seen that before. And we've read about this in anthropology books, we've never met one of you. That's how they view Christians. Number two is to go rather than wait. And so this is the idea that we get engaged rather than creating more Christian bubbles. Some churches, we create our own Christian softball league so we can play softball, and then we invite all our non-Christian friends into it. Not a terrible idea, but there's another way where we could just all go join existing softball leagues as Christians and just invade their space. Number three, he calls coffee dinner gospel. I like this one. This is actually what I do a lot. These are common elements of our life, and his whole thing is some people, there are certain conversations we're allowed to have in certain spaces, right? So in public space in our country, secularized countries, you don't talk about religion or politics. That's viewed to be kind of more personally held beliefs. So if we go to something with public space, it's expected that the conversation stays more on sports, on movies, on families, on interests, on hobbies, not on deeper spiritual things. If you're from another country, this has probably frustrated you at some point about our culture. Why won't Americans engage in conversation about things that matter? We will, it just has to be in a different space. And so his whole thing is, you can see where he's walking them down a path. So inviting someone to coffee, it's a limited commitment. So you might have a friend at work that you talk regularly with, and you could invite them to coffee. This is a public event. But typically coffee only lasts till the cup is gone, and could be 20 minutes, could be 30 minutes, but it's not. There's no expectation that it goes any longer. So if they're done in 30 minutes, they can walk away, and that feeling of being able to walk away, might make them accept the invitation. And so in this is a good time to ask questions and to learn. Second step for him, so after multiple coffees, is try to get them over for a dinner. So now we've moved from public space, where all the public normal conversations happen, to private space. Well, in private space, this is more intimate. You get to see me in my living environment, or I get to see you in your living environment. We see your pictures on the wall, and it's a much more intimate connection, which means the conversation can also move deeper. And so that's when he introduces the gospel. The next one is listen to their story. We're going to focus a lot on storying, starting tonight actually, and there are different ways we're going to tell our own story. and then the Bible story. But part of this is based on listening to their story. Sometimes when we learn evangelism, we just learn how to talk to them. I notice this a lot with language learners. You know, if I study some language, I think, well, I want to be able to say this. And so most people, when they test on verbal skills versus listening skills, typically their verbal skills are much higher than their listening. We value my ability to communicate much more than my ability to understand. And I think we can apply this in a lot of areas, and one of those is evangelism, where it's more important that I say what I came to say than that I hear what's happening in your life. Well, when we learn to listen to their story, we find touch points with the biblical story. And so as we move into our next section here in a minute, we're going to look at how do we go from one of these questions that they have to a biblical story. And then the Bible actually really becomes relevant. Number 5 is tell our story as a story. I'm not going to unpack this one because we'll do this in the next section. And then number 6 is tell a story about Jesus. This often comes out of the listening component, where we think, well, it's only the gospel if I share, you know, you're a sinner, God loves you, he died for you, you say this prayer. But there are times where we can take kind of seeds of the gospel and plant them and water them and prune them along the way, where it doesn't have to be the whole picture in one conversation, especially if we're doing this with people that we know, right? If there's a scenario where there's coffee, dinner, gospel going on with a coworker, obviously this is not going to be our last time to talk with them, so we don't have to give everything we know in the first conversation or the first opportunity. And so sometimes it might just be listening for where are they at spiritually, what are they struggling with, earning trust to get to that point where they share that thing, and then go, okay, this actually reminds me of the story of Jesus. And so we can tell a story of Jesus in an inviting way where it doesn't have to be, and if you don't believe this, you're wrong and you're going to hell, kind of emphasis on the end of it. So those are six strategies from Sam Chan.